right, let's begin with a blessing to sanctify our learning. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank God for giving us the Torah and this space to learn together. We didn't play any music today, and that's a kind of a nod of respect to our topic, which, if you weren't here with us last week, this is the part 2, though I think we'll do enough of a kind of a running start that you'll be able to catch up. But part 2, considering the status of the deaf, of a deaf person in Jewish law. And as I said last week, and I'll just say again, for those who weren't here, this is a personal topic for me. I come from a deaf family. My parents are deaf, and I am aware of the ways in which my family members have been excluded from full participation in Jewish life. So in all kinds of subtle ways, but sometimes in very explicit and formal ways. I told a story last week of being at my father's Shiva and having someone there, a noted Hasidic pop star actually, insist that we couldn't start the minyan because some of the people in the room were deaf and they didn't count in the minyan. So, and I, as I said last week, I was in my early 20s and I didn't know anything about Jewish law then. So I I've never been more humiliated and sort of outraged, but I also was maybe fittingly mute in that moment because I just didn't know, is this guy right? And part of what I want to explore with you all is, the legal structure upon which someone like that is leaning, because, I feel a connection to this topic personally that that in a way that wants to reach a certain kind of outcome, to kind of create a space for a greater space for deaf people, full participation in Jewish life. But now that I have been studying for a couple of decades Jewish law, I do understand, and I think those of you who were with us last week also understand a little better where that kind of attitude comes from, and maybe even where where one could ground it in legal sources. And today's class, so we'll just do a little bit of a review of that, but today's class will take us into the modern period, not the contemporary, but modernity. And we'll start to see things being reformulated in ways that are important for our topic, and also just, I think, interesting for understanding the movement of Jewish law. We will not, I think, today reach what I would consider a happy ending. I don't think, and this is in some ways, one I must admit that aside from a total lack of sensitivity or compassion that man showed to a family in mourning, that we will understand at the end of this conversation that what legal ground he was standing on, and why we're not there yet in terms of really being able to respond fully and affirmatively in defense of full participation of deaf people in Jewish life. So, on that note, I want to just dedicate this learning to my father, Yeshua Avram Yosef ben David, who has always been the primary influence in my Jewish life, and certainly has has certainly participated in Judaism in the fullest way, despite obstacles. Okay, let's begin. What I want to do, I need to give you some of the background information and before we get into our sources today. And this is an unusual class for us. And I just felt at the end of last class that we had to keep going. We had to thoroughly explore this topic. I feel I do anyway. This is my first time teaching on this topic, and I really need to really flesh it out for myself. But we started last week. This class actually is a Mishna class, the Mishna that the Rabbinic Code put together in the 3rd century. So we're not going to be looking at Mishna today. We're going to be in the getting to know, for a lot of us, the genre of responsa, of legal responses formal responses to legal questions, which is the genre that really most defines Jewish law in the post-medieval period. But let's just take just so we have the core pieces of information that we used last week. Let's just go back for a second and just take a look at the very key sources that we looked at last week. And actually, I'll give you links as we go along in case you want to look at these things on your own. This is our source sheet from last week in the chat. And we went through and looked at all of the early sources that discuss deafness, but just for our purposes, we can just start with these 2 Mishnayot. One that starts, the first mention of the deaf in that early code is a mention of those who do not give truma, do not give the tithe to the priests. It doesn't count if they do, right? If they do so, their truma is not considered truma. In other words, they don't have the legal status to give truma. I think of it as a 7-year-old paying taxes. Those taxes wouldn't even register. They would be like, oh, well, this doesn't make sense. You don't have the status to file taxes. We won't even take your money. And the 7-year-old is a good example because the category which gets introduced to us here is a cherish, a shoteh, and a katan. Cherish, shoteh, and katan. And that is a deaf person, a mentally incapable person, a mentally challenged person, and a katan is a minor. Okay, so that was part 1, is that we saw the deaf person introduced to us in this category, which becomes a kind of a trope in Jewish legal literature. Cherish, shoteh, v'katan. The deaf person, I still don't know what the best translation for this is. In some of the sources, you'll read imbecile, and that's not, a kind translation, but someone who's mentally challenged. And then katan is easy, a person who is a minor, not a bar mitzvah yet, right? So not 18, but not 13, right? In Jewish law, but we understand that category. And I guess we also understand that someone who is mentally challenged also might not be considered capable of participating fully in civic life and in civic ritual life as well. And then, of course, our problem is, well, what about the deaf person? And certainly someone like me, but I think all of us have at this point some sense that deaf people have the mental faculties to participate fully in a reasoned way in the community. And we explored last week, well, what is the thing that unites these 3? It is a presumption that these 3 people are not bnei deah. They don't have that mental capacity. So what does that mean? Like, what do you mean? Deaf people do. So aren't they just not in that category? And actually the Mishna, this same early code, quickly rushes in and actually gives us something very valuable, which is a definition of the deaf person that it, in a way, does away with the problem ab initio. And that is as follows. the second Mishnah there in Truma, after telling us that a deaf person doesn't give a Truma, takes a moment to step aside, almost as if anticipating our question, well, is a deaf person really like a minor or a mentally challenged person? And the Mishnah says a cheresh, and this is the word for deaf people. Cheresh, we'll be using this word a lot. Here it is in the Hebrew, a cheresh. A cheresh who speaks but cannot hear may not give truma, but if he does so, his truma is truma. In other words, well, if we're not sure what this deaf person, we're not sure what they are, whether they fall in the status or not. In the end, when they do give truma, it does count. That's a little bit of a blurry category, but here's the clear category. The cheresh of whom the sages generally speak is one who neither hears nor speaks. That's it. So the person that we are thinking of in the categories of the formal categories of Jewish law that does not count is someone who cannot hear or speak. The Mishnah is very clear on that. Now, every deaf, as I said, not every, but just about every deaf person I have ever met speaks in some way. They make sound with their mouths while they talk. So as far as I'm concerned, I look at that Mishnah and I think, okay, well, that does away with that, right? That they're, as long as that person actually speaks, they're in. But of course, it's not so simple. And the reason that it's not so simple is because we don't know what the Mishnah means by speaks. And anyway, the Mishnah seems to leave the category a little blurry, like, oh, well, if they do speak, then it would count, but it's still not ideal somehow. So there's something murky there. And the last source that we'll look at from last week, which is, in a sense, the source that this offensive man at my father's Shiva was theoretically using, the Shulchan Aruch, the standard code of Jewish law, which tries to synthesize all of the information, the Jewish discussion from the Mishnah on through the 16th century. This is a book that was published in the 1500s. Says a person that can hear but not speak, or speak but not hear, that person is like hearing people and they can be included in a minyan. But if they neither hear nor speak, they are treated like a mentally incompetent person or a minor. Okay? So there you have it. A person who can hear or speak does count in a minyan. A person who can do neither does not count in a minyan. In a minyan, a prayer quorum, which is, again, that's that situation that I found myself in. And I think that part of the issue is that different deaf people speak at different levels of intelligibility. My father was a very clear speaker, and I don't recall him ever being not counted for a minyan, though maybe, I don't know, maybe some people were and I wasn't aware of it. But my father's best friend, who was in the room that day, did not speak very well. If you knew him, you would know what he was saying, but if you didn't, you wouldn't. And, so now you can see how, at least if you wanted to exclude a deaf person from it, you can see where that comes from. Okay, we did a lot of work last week thinking about, well, what is speech? And we saw little hints of the possibility that writing could count as speech, or that even gestures could count as speech. But in the end, there was enough messiness in the Talmudic discussion. And some people felt that it had nothing, that really it was the original categories were not about how clear your speech was, but whether you had been born hearing and developed full speech and then became deaf, and that person would count. And a person who was born deaf and never learned how to speak, that wouldn't count. And once that category is introduced, then it's kind of like, well, it's not even clear if any deaf person speech counts. And we sort of like the issue kind of died there on the rocks. But we are now, remember the Shulchan Aruch is published in 1550, and we're now going to pick up in around 1600 in the 17th century. And the reason that we're doing that is because things are changing in important ways. To be fair to, and we did some of this work last time, to be fair to the rabbinic discussion, it, I think, was generally assumed that deaf people were not, were impossible to educate. One could not teach a deaf person at all, and if they're not educated, then they're not communicating, and one doesn't, or at least communicating very simply, and one doesn't know actually whether this person is mentally capable or not. And I think that historically deaf people both were treated as mentally incompetent, but also were given such little education that effectively they were mentally incompetent, right? Okay, but first of all, as I'm sure we can all intuit, there were many deaf people throughout history that, despite those impossible circumstances, managed to make enough to puncture the wall enough to make it clear that they did have intelligence. And so we'll consider some cases like that. But the most important thing is that in the 17th century, things begin to change. In 1620, a priest named Juan Pablo Benet publishes really the first book thinking about educating the deaf, teaching deaf people how to speak, a book about oral education. And then in the 18th century, really just the 18th century, right? This is like amazing that it doesn't go further back than that, but just in the 18th century, we start to see schools for the deaf pop up in England, in France, and then for our purposes, like critically for the Jewish discussion, in Vienna in 1779, a school for the deaf is founded, and some Jews start to go there, and that's where we begin to get the very idea of what it means to be deaf is obviously changing in the culture, in the zeitgeist. But also there are some, now there are some specific references to those schools that we'll find in the legal literature. So that's where we're going to go. But I want to remind us of one last thing before we do, because this is in some ways the device that we're going to use to think about all of the legal material that we come across. The distinction between formalist and realist modes of interpreting the law. And we came across this last week. Is Peter here? Peter is always reminding us, Peter, a law professor, is always reminding us of that distinction, that dichotomy in legal thought. And to say it simply, a formalist approach is concerned with the letter of the law, and a realist approach is more concerned with the intention of the law, right? And we see this tension continue to play out on our Supreme Court today. So this is a real, and along the way, we will consider the virtues and the challenges of each mode. But just to give us a sense of what it would mean, a formalist approach to the law looks at the letters of the Mishna, the words of the Mishna that we just looked at, and said, well, if a deaf person can speak, that deaf person is not in the category, and if they cannot speak, they are in the category. That's all there is to it. It's you follow the letter of the law. A realist approach might say, well, it's clear that there's a category that is meant to keep those who are not mentally developed from participating fully in the social ritual realm. And now that we know that a deaf person is fully developed, certainly they can, right? The purpose of the law can still be fulfilled. Okay, so that's like a formalist, realist, and then there's all kinds of space in the middle, like if you say, oh, a deaf person who can speak can be counted in a minyan, but what is speech really? Speech is communication, and so even if that deaf person is writing or signing, that also counts. That's like a formalist approach to the category, but a realist definition of what it means to speak. Not literally speak, but what's the intention of that? Okay, so those are two legal paradigms that I think will be important for us to keep in mind. Okay, and I'll be doing a little more talking than usual during this, because I want to take us through some of the material, and so that we can kind of really see, and this is new, I think, for a lot of us. The material we're going to look at today, again, is responsa, and the legal material in the Talmudic period is the Talmud. The Talmud is the discussion of the Mishna, this first rabbinic code, and then in the medieval period, the great legal genre is codes. In other words, let's try to synthesize everything we've learned and put it into a clear code format. We saw that the Shulchan Aruch is a code, the one that was published in 1550. And then after those codes get written, then there's like a looser genre, the genre of responsa, where rabbis are sent questions from either people in their own community or other communities, if they're known as a great rabbi, and they're asked, how do we apply the law given our circumstances? And the rabbi responds, and the letter back is a responsa. And what's important about this genre is that we often, in the midst of it, and historians do great work on this, we get these kind of like along the way, we get these very vivid descriptions of what was happening in that reality at that time. And we're going to actually we're not going to today spend a ton of time really hard driving on what the law ultimately is, because as I've already suggested, the law has not, in some ways, been fully formulated. There's still a lot of messy reckoning and debating around whether or not full status can be full religious legal status can be accorded to the deaf, but we will see the difficult, sometimes painful reflection on the situation, the situation at hand. Okay. Any questions before I dive in, or comments? Let's go then. So here's what I want to give you, and I want to say I leaned very heavily on Rabbi Dov Linzer's. Dov Linzer is not just some rabbi, but in fact was my Rosh Yeshiva in rabbinical school, and he's done some really great work on this topic, and I basically just reviewed it and then tried to condense it. But if you want a fuller treatment of what we're looking at today, here in the chat is the part 2 of our discussion, and why not, I'll just give you part 1 as well. They're linked together, but if you wanted, you could just read these and get a sense of this is part 1, and get a sense of where our discussion went last week. Okay, I've been giving you a lot of links, but I'm just about to give you one more, which is this week's, let's see, this week's class, and the pieces that we're going to look at today, and that is right here. Okay, you see all those links there? So the last one is our class for today. All right, let's begin. That was quite an introduction, but I think now we're well positioned. So we are going to look now at a couple of, we're going to start in the 1600s. And I got to say, we're going to start with 2 very sad pieces. I think these pieces give us a sense of like things beginning to change, but rabbis really not there yet. Not really, they're seeing new information, but they're not, it's too new, and it's very difficult for them to imagine how they might formulate the law differently. And in some ways, the major changes haven't happened yet. There aren't schools for the deaf yet. And so this also gives us a sense of what kinds of answers were rabbis giving before then. And as you'll see, there are ways in which they are sympathetic and ways in which they are just heartless, but really clueless in thinking about these things. Okay, so here's our first piece from, let's take a screen share here, from the Tzemach Tzedek. The Tzemach Tzedek was a great legal thinker, but also one of the Rebbes in the Lubavitch dynasty, in the Chabad dynasty. Okay, so one of the Chabad rabbis, there were 7 altogether. And this rabbi is another Menachem Mendel, like the last one, Menachem Mendel Krochmal. And he has asked the question, even the questions here are very sad, because the question is, can a deaf, the question comes, a deaf man is going to marry my sister. How should we do that, right? Can a deaf person get married in the classical way? Just the question itself is like so sad. Like, oh, could a deaf person even get married? You know, so that's where we're at at this point in history. And look at how the Tzemach Tzedek at once does recognize that a deaf person is mentally competent, and yet ultimately, well, we'll see what he does here. Let's take a look at his response. Okay, so they ask the question, you know, this deaf person's very, very smart, and in fact, the Tzemach Tzedek says, yeah, I know who you're talking about, right? That person is known to us, but regarding that person in your place who cannot hear and not speak, that person does not speak, and I'm not even sure about cannot, because in a society where nobody's listening or focusing on your speech, I'm not even sure that this deaf person really has any reason to try to do anything but gesture, but they don't speak, and therefore that person is not an ilem, which is a person who is mute, but a cherish, a person who is deaf and not speaking, right? And the Tzemach Tzedek says, although he is very smart, he is smart. I recognize that this person is smart, but we do not differentiate between the cherishim. Okay, now I ask you to consider there, is this opinion a formalist or a realist opinion? Right? Keep that question in mind. Although he's very smart, we do not differentiate between the cherishim. And then listen to this anecdote. I saw one of my teachers whose practice it was to take with the cherish to the chuppah a person the cherish was familiar with, like one of his brothers or other relatives who grew up with him in the same house, who could understand his gesturing. This person would gesture to him the issue of the kiddushin, the marriage, and the cherish would put a ring on the woman and would marry her. I saw this in Krakow, done by a cherish who also was a tailor and who was very intelligent, and he was a clothes merchant selling the clothes he had made. And I saw that he would often bring a suit against people in court, and sometimes he would be the defendant, and many of the town people understood his gestures because he was very smart and was easily understood. It's like, you're almost there. My gosh, this guy is a full member of society. He's bringing court cases. Nevertheless, he married his wife with the assistance of one of his brothers, who he took with him to the chuppah, as was stated above. So it's like, like this person has they're bringing cases in court. It actually doesn't make a lot of sense. It doesn't make a lot of, like, if the person does not have legal status, they can't really be bringing cases in court anyway. So it's almost as if the rabbi is kind of trying to grapple with a reality that's getting away from, like, this person already is functioning as a full member in society. But when it comes to something the rabbis have control over, the wedding ceremony, they default to, no, this person can't get married in the, and just think of that, like, you're getting married and you have to bring your brother up to say, yeah, he'll marry her. You know, like, that's your wedding day, right? And it's, you know, that is just a sense of the ceremony. The truth is, the Tzemach Tzedek goes on and says, and the marriage itself is not a full marriage. It's not a real kiddushin. Okay, just so we keep trying, I'm going to move through these sources pretty methodically, but just so we keep track here, was that a formalist or a realist opinion? Anybody have a sense?
Formalist.
Formalist, why, Joe? That's correct. Why?
Because he's still adhering to the letter of the law. He's not really trying to apply it to any situation. So, to how people, or in this case, the person functions in the situation and the intent. It's just what the law says is how he goes.
Good, great. That's right. I mean, he acknowledges the real difference, between this person who is so clearly capable and intelligent and the suspicion that from the tradition that a deaf person is someone who is not mentally capable. But the tradition says someone who doesn't hear and doesn't speak is in this category. That's the category. This person technically doesn't hear and technically doesn't speak. So formally, they're in that category, and that's all there is to it. Okay? So that gives you a sense of how, even as the issue starts to become glaring, I imagine that in earlier centuries, it was very uncommon for a deaf person to prove themselves enough to kind of begin to break through. But I'm sure you had cases like this going all the way back. And though we have a sense from reading this that, on the ground, people did often treat deaf people who could display intelligence with a greater degree of inclusion and respect. Nevertheless, the rabbinic tradition is stuck to its categories. The next piece now I want to share with you is even more sad, even sadder, though I want to share it with you in part because I think in it we can start to see the crumbling of this formalism. That is, we can see in the opinion, and here we're going to look at the opinion of a rabbi from Morocco, a Sephardic rabbi, but also from the 1600s, still feeling stuck with the category, but starting to feel uncomfortable with it. Okay, so take a look here, and the question here, I mean, like, if the last question was sad, the question here is really disturbing. Actually, the question comes in like, do we have the same responsibility to save a deaf person's life if they, for example, drown on the Sabbath? Because you can only violate the Sabbath according to Jewish law for someone who has full status as a member of your community, right? I mean, that already, we could like outrage a lot around that. There are distinctions between Jews and non-Jews there. I mean, it's like, very difficult area, but again, it's a formal category. You have responsibility when anyone in your community is in danger on Shabbat to break the Shabbat for them, right? But does a deaf person not count? Now, I want to just say, this is an interesting piece of responsa because he starts off by saying, and I didn't quote this far, but he starts off by saying like, look, we would do this. We would save any deaf person. Let me just begin by saying we would save any deaf person and we would save any mentally challenged person, obviously, but it is a difficult legal issue. I don't know exactly how to make sense of it in the law, but let's be honest, we're never going to let that happen. And he says, we hope that we're not confronted with this issue, but we would do it. Okay, so that's already like a very kind of like disturbing beginning to the whole conversation. But then let's take a look at where he's at, and I think we can really see some pathos in the man. Okay, so a cherish, he says, is as opposed to a mentally incompetent person who is thought to be someone who has no intellect. A cherish is someone considered to be someone who has weak intellect. Right? It's not fully there, and that's what the Talmud says in Yevamot. But he says, it is well known that a cherish, there's a typo there, it is well known that a cherish has no disability other than his ability to hear. And it is because he cannot hear that he cannot learn from other people. We have found that there are many cherishim who are very smart. So just like listen to that, he's already, in some ways, he's already just like, snickety snack, just like doing away with just centuries of misconception. oh, the Talmud says that a deaf person is mentally not all there, but first of all, we know that deaf people, the only not all there is that they can't educate themselves, right? Nobody is educating them. And in fact, we know that deaf people are fully capable. We know some who are very, very smart. And he gives an example. And here there was a cherish who was a Kohen, a priest, and he was a big tailor in the city, and he would take a siddur at the time of prayers, and they would gesture to him, and he would understand and was well versed in this, and he would rise up at the time of prayers and lift his hands for the priestly blessing. And it was easy to teach this person. So here again, giving a little anecdotal reality that like this person was clearly counted in a minyan. In fact, that he gave the priestly blessing. Or was he not counted but allowed to go up there with the other priests? It's hard to say. But here he is describing someone, and this is a guy who in the end is also not going to permit deaf people to have full legal status, but he does ask this question at the end, which is just heartbreaking. The matter then is very difficult. Why should he be considered like an animal? Why would this person have the same basic status as an animal? What he means by that is you're not allowed to save a cow who's drowning on Shabbat. So how is it possible that we would equate this person with a cow when we know that this person's fully capable? I mean, leaving aside the fact that like the law has already landed in a disturbing place where like certain people without mental status have fallen into one category, and that puts them in a different category of life. I mean, it's just the whole thing's disturbing. But here he is trying to push the deaf person through this category by trying his best to rethink, how could this possibly be? All right, I see some responses. Ken?
I just have one question. This was a response. So what was the question that was actually posed to Hagiz?
If a deaf person or a mentally challenged person is drowning on Shabbat, or is like, can we violate the Sabbath to save their lives? Okay. I know that is almost like what part of what we're trying to consider here is the formalist and realist approaches and the demerits and merits of each, and the demerits of the formalist approach. And I think that's part of what's happening here in the laws around deafness. But the truth is, we can think of that in its exclusion of all sorts of categories. The formalist approach can get so tangled up in its own inner logic that it ends up like producing results which are horrifying to the ethical eye. Right? That's part of what happens when like laws just have their own logic and they just get applied without thinking about the real world implication. But that's part of the question here. And I almost like, yeah. It's such an explosively horrible area of Jewish law that's almost like it's hard to just introduce it here and then move on. But it gives you a sense of the stakes of the kind of status that we're reckoning with here. All right, I'm going to take one more hand and then we're going to push forward a little. Jen?
Yeah, what you were saying, you kind of made a comment earlier about how if we have a category that says there's no point in talking to somebody, then they won't learn how to talk. They won't learn how to communicate. There's a reciprocity or a feedback loop going on. And it made me think about how formalism as an approach can end up not paying attention to how the categories and the dictates of law create a reality that then reinforces the categories of the law. If we say that this person can't be educated and therefore they should be in this category, that creates a group of people who aren't educated who then reinforce to us that that category is real and should stay in the law that way. And it made me think about how like formalism, whether or not it acknowledges that, whether there's that idea of a feedback loop and a way of accounting for that in the way that law gets applied.
Yeah. This is a really interesting question and gets into the kind of like legal theory in a way that is like, probably beyond the scope of our discussion today. But I think you really are onto something, Jen. And I'll tell you that here's a version of a response to your question. There are areas in Jewish law where something is considered forbidden. Here's an example. It is forbidden in Jewish law, in ancient Jewish law, for women to wear men's clothing. And so women have to, according to early formulations, have to wear skirts, not pants. But now there are women's pants. Women wear pants. It's not men's clothing, right? We can think about a lot of, we can think about these issues as they begin to like reformulate trans identity as well, right? In our period. But imagine just the moment where women are starting to wear pants, there are actually legal formulations that say, well, the first few women who did this were in violation of the law, but now it's no longer, that's no longer like a category. Like now it is okay to wear pants because we know that women wear pants. So there's a kind of like, you can see there that's a kind of like, that's a kind of corollary to your position where formalism has its own logic that no longer makes any sense. And actually like it can be undone, but in a way that like the law doesn't really have any mechanism for recognizing that evolution, right? So that is one of the shortcomings, I think, of the formalist position. And let's be clear, just as we're having these legal theoretical discussions, is that there are shortcomings to the realist position. And in a word, the challenge of the realist position, why is it even a debate on the Supreme Court today? Shouldn't we always just go by what the law was intended and not get caught up in maybe if you think God gave the law, okay, but like, why does Scalia think it's important to adhere to the formal language of and part of the reason that formalists usually give is they're like, well, once it's up to you to say what the law means, you can say anything. We're beholden to the letters of the law because without that, we have nothing. Okay, all right. So those are a couple of really sad moments, I think, in the, I won't even say development yet, because we're about to see the development of the status of the deaf in Jewish law. And here, these opinions now take us into, notably, the next century when actually deaf schools are starting to pop up. And both of the next opinions make reference to that school. I wrote it down here somewhere. What's it called? The Taubstummen. The Taubstummen school in Vienna, where deaf people were beginning to be educated. Now, both of these opinions actually do permit deaf people to have greater status. But again, I want you to ask whether what we're hearing is a formalist or a realist opinion, because again, it's a helpful binary for clarifying where these people are coming from and how they are thinking through these issues. So let's take a look. Now, this next piece, I have to say, it's meaningful to me because it's the first opinion that really seriously considers that deaf people, through their education, are leaving the category of the Cheresh. And it is written by the Divrei Chaim, Rav Chaim Halberstal. And the Divrei Chaim was a Hasidic Rebbe, and actually my family were Sanzer Hasidim. He was the Rebbe of Sanz. And so it is meaningful to me that the first real permissive opinion here comes from a kind of Hasidic lineage that I identify with. There's a little connection there that no one else would notice, but it means a lot to me. But here's the Divrei Chaim. And tell me, is this opinion formalist or realist? The Divrei Chaim says, okay, so, you know, the whole history of deafness. However, in our case, if they can speak a little, even if only inarticulately, vafilu belashon agalim, and would be in the category of one who speaks, in a similar way as an earlier opinion the Maharit wrote, in such a case, it would seem, in my humble opinion, that they are like pikrim, meaning fully sensory activated people. They have full legal status. Okay, formalist or realist? Formalist, if they can speak even a little bit, formalist or realist? Raise your hands for formalist. Raise your hands for realist. More people saying realist. I think this is a formalist opinion. A formalist opinion in that a deaf person who can speak, even if the speech is not, it's speech. Technically, it's speech. Do you understand it? No. And in a sense, it defies the realist definition, because it's not like even the purpose of speech is to communicate. This deaf person can't actually do that through speech, but they technically can speak. And as I said, most deaf people I know can make audible sounds, and that's enough. So the big advance here, although it seems like a little advance, the big advance here is that this deaf person's speech, however good it is, can count. But that is still very much embedded in this formalist category of like, well, is it a deaf person who can neither hear or speak, or is it a deaf person who can not hear but can speak? And this person can, and we're not going to get all messed up in the language, in wondering whether that speech actually counts or whether it's good enough, or as later opinions will do. Okay, here's another opinion that also makes reference to these schools and offers a different paradigm. And I'm going to ask you whether this is formalist or realist, but now you kind of know, because this is the other one. Okay, so take a look. This is Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer, who started. Now we're already into the 1800s. Who started a rabbinical school in Berlin, and Hildesheimer, who's known for a little bit. He's like sort of like a more modern thinker, like kind of like 1800s modernity coming. I mean, these are the kinds of Jews they had in Berlin. Even the traditionalists were trying like to integrate modernity. And this is the birthplace of Reform Judaism as well. So really grappling with modernity here. And listen to what he says here. The language here is I think quite beautiful. In my humble opinion, it seems that the issue hinges on the question of whether the intellectual capacity of a Cherish is damaged, or whether it is inherently normal, but like a hidden treasure. Ke'en otsar ganuz. This is just a fascinating, and I think a beautiful moment, right? Like, we have to figure out, and he's still asking it as if like, well, we don't know. This opinion isn't all the way there, but really it comes down to whether this person has full intellectual capacity. And he says, are they really, like, if we got inside their minds, would we see that they were mentally deficient? Or would it be like their minds were there waiting for us, like a hidden treasure? And think of their minds, their souls, their whole personalities of so many people throughout history who were hidden away, like a hidden treasure, undiscovered. And this opinion at least is imagining that maybe it's our problem. Maybe we don't see that the deaf person is actually there, that treasure just waiting, their intellect just waiting to be discovered. Okay, let me break here. I want to show you a couple more things before we close. In fact, the next piece is going to be, I think, the most important, but let's just see some of the responses that have been, Yonatan's hand has been up for a while. So I don't want to pose a question because I'm not sure where you're coming in, Yonatan.
There was something you said at the introduction to last week's class to the effect of that you wouldn't feel comfortable poskening on some of these issues because they're so personal to you because your family's deaf. That's really stuck with me because what we have here is a situation where you have two groups, the hearing group and the deaf group. And one group has made, for millennia, all the decisions not only for itself but for the other group. And there's no reciprocity there. And these decisions look like that. In the best case, the bottom line decision is a good decision, but the underlying logic is always dehumanizing. And you repeatedly see this logic of, oh, well, of course this person has the ability to consent to marriage because they act in the world in a way that makes sense to my sensibilities as a hearing person. I'm capable of perceiving their intellect. And because I matter and I'm capable of perceiving their intellect, therefore they matter. I wonder what it would take in Judaism to have a case where a deaf person sends a deaf rabbi a letter and says, oh my God, Rabbi, my sibling is about to marry a hearing person. Is this person allowed to get married? Right? Like, these are the questions that never come up. It's not just with deaf people and it's not just with people with disabilities. I mean, it's for a long time, it's been men making decisions for men and women, people who have been straight and cis, or at least outwardly identified as straight and cis, making decisions for all genders and all sexual identities. And it's something we are only just beginning to learn to overcome.
Yeah, okay, that's all very well said, and I won't repeat it. You made a lot of important points, including there at the end where you link this sort of legal struggle with all kinds of legal struggles in Jewish law. In some ways, most notably, the struggle for egalitarian status between men and women in Jewish law, where there too you have men making decisions for women. I want to point out two things. One, the formalist approach, you can see why it is appealing to a group of people who don't actually have the lived experience to like make sense of the reality, right? Like the formalist approach at least has like you just follow the language of the words, the logic of the words. And we can ask who first formulated the words, but like in every moment where someone is making an opinion like this and leaning on the formalist position, I think because of what you're talking about, Yonatan, we have another insight into why formalism has the power it has, which is that it allows for the kind of cloak of objectivity. Like I'm not saying anything about women or gay people or deaf people. It's just, these are the law, we're stuck, right? And in order to take a realist position, you have to have some sense of what's really going on. Now, I want to say, this is personal to me, and I did say last week that I feel to a certain extent like it's a little hard for me to think objectively in this realm because I have such a deep emotional relationship to it, but that is not the only reason that I would not decide a legal matter. Like I wouldn't issue a legal opinion. The other and kind of greater reason that I would not is because I am not considered, I don't consider myself, and I am not considered to be one of the Jewish legal experts of the day. And part of the problem, and you identify a problem very well, Yonatan, which is that deaf people are not part of this conversation. Women have not been part of this conversation. Out gay people have not been part of this conversation. But it isn't just being part of the conversation. It requires women ascending to the highest levels of the conversation so they become considered some of the great legal minds of the time, right? Think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's role in reformulating the laws around the equal status of women in our society. It's like you needed someone to actually be of that status of a legal thinker in order to be in the game, right? So that's part of the challenge too. It's not just letting the outsider in, but also waiting for the point where the outsider has enough authority to be able to really speak to their own lived experience in the context of that legal discussion, that legal conversation. Okay, we're towards the end of our hour. I want to show you at least this next piece, and then maybe we'll actually we'll just take a look at where at some of where things might go from here. But this next piece actually, I think, is the most important piece. And we're not, as I said, we're not really looking at the legal conclusions here. We're just like trying to get a sense of how are these rabbis thinking. And there is this amazing piece in the writing of we're now in the hold on, I'm trying to find it. Yeah, here it is. We're now in the 1800s, and now even schools for deaf Jewish kids are popping up. So that I think in 1844 there is the first deaf Jewish school, and I think it was also in Austria. So listen to this is the Shevet Sofer, who's writing a legal responsa. He has a book called Shevet Sofer, but his father was the Katav Sofer. There's the Chatam Sofer, the Katav Sofer, and the Shevet Sofer. They all name their books. Their last name is Sofer, so it's the Sofer family. But he's actually talking about his father, the middle Sofer. And I got to tell you, this is not an opinion where he ends up concluding yes, you can give deaf people full legal status, but along the way, he describes this moment that I think is so important for our entire discussion of deaf status in Jewish law, but also of some of the other issues that Yonatan was raising of all kinds of outsider status in Jewish law. Take a look at this piece. If you only showed up to read this today, Dayenu, that would be enough. And so he's discussing, and then he says, and I've heard a number of times from my master, my father, great rabbi, my father, Zatzal, the tzaddik of blessed memory, that he was in doubt whether indeed they are obligated in mitzvot. And that once when he was in Vienna, he was invited by the staff to visit the school for the deaf and honor them with his presence. It's a funny point. Honor them with his presence and to see with his own eyes their wonderful work of theirs. And he was astounded by what he saw, how they were able to teach the deaf who could not speak, so much so that this doubt entered his heart that perhaps they should be considered as a fully intelligent person and obligated in mitzvot. Listen to this language here. And I seem to recall, ukimedumali, I seem to recall that he said he asked the teachers there to take tefillin and put them on them. Like whatever else this is or represents, and that this guy probably is not like the person we want speaking on behalf of the deaf community and not fully sense that, but just that moment. What happened in that moment when he went to the deaf school and he was so overwhelmed by what he saw that he was like, get out the tefillin. These people need to put on tefillin. What do you think happened there? Like what is actually, it's a beautiful little story, but what is happening? What is he doing in that moment? Hannah?
Well, it kind of reminds me of something that Yonatan was saying earlier, but it reminds me of the importance of proximity. Like, how do you stay proximal to identities that are different from yours or experiences that are different from yours? And that, yeah, we've had for so long all these people in specific categories making halakha or other kinds of decisions for those of us who aren't in those categories. But I think things often change through specificity. It's so much easier to say deaf people as a whole are or are not capable of XYZ thing. And then you experience a deaf person, or you go to a deaf school, or you develop relationships with people who have that identity, and suddenly you see it from a different perspective. And it often people speak of that in terms of, hating certain groups of people, that you have some stereotype, you write off this whole group, and then you meet someone and you're like, wait, gay people are like John who lives next door. Like, I like John, he's a cool dude, whatever. It seems to me like that's a moment of that for him, that he's realizing, I've been speaking in such vague terms about these people who have a real lived experience, and now I'm seeing what that is, and I was wrong.
Yeah. I think that's very well said. I mean, what we're seeing here is someone who is finally, right, witness to the full humanity of deaf people. He just sees it, and in that moment, I don't know what he actually held, and I'm not sure, his son certainly is not that permissive at the end of this responsa, but at least in that moment, he's like, oh my gosh, I was wrong. I see it now. The treasure has been revealed. I see the full humanity of these people. We'll look at one last piece here before we close, but really this is the point. Really, this is the point that I think Jewish law is, kind of rumbling through, trying to take account of its source material, with an eye to its application in any current moment. But when we think about this moment, I think part of what we see is that that the law is the law must strive to take full account of the humanity of its subjects. That has to be the basis, the foundation, And I think that if you look at some of the parallel kind of struggles for, as others have been saying, struggles for equality under the law, whether Jewish law or other systems of law, right, American law. These struggles, like that, you can play with categories and changing reality, but they are really driven along by some core recognition that this person is a full human being, and their humanity in its fullness must be recognized. And it's okay to say, well, this person has limited capacities in this way, and to reckon with that. But part of what's happened here is that this rabbi realizes that he thought that he misunderstood the humanity of the subjects in front of him. He did not see the full humanity of the subjects in front of him. And we can imagine the way that plays out in all sorts of legal categories. All right, we are just about done here, and I don't have any like brilliant last pieces to give you because there sadly isn't a lot of great and clear legal material out there that fully affirms the status of deaf people in Jewish ritual life. But I want to share with you one last piece that I think points in the right direction, which is a piece from a 20th century Israeli rabbi. And he writes that it appears, though, that all of these rulings that come before me were said when the person was not educated. But with this education that we now have, that was not known in the time of our sages, a deaf person leaves the status of one who is not a person of intellect, for this modern education is a full remedy of his condition. So, in other words, like an educated deaf person should be thought of as no longer in the category altogether, right? A deaf person who can be shown to be thinking, right? And we're, we could see that through sign language, we could see that through written, or we could just see it through their behavior in the community, which we've been tracking all along. These rabbis throughout history have been noticing that deaf people have this fuller capability. This rabbi is actually saying what feels inevitable, which is that is clearly not what the sages were talking about. Once we've demonstrated that this is a fully thinking subject, then we have to respond accordingly. It is as if they have been healed. But just note that he still feels bound to the formal category. He's like, technically they're not deaf. They've been healed from their deafness. Still trying to kind of reckon with, well, what do we do with that category? Oh, we still have to redefine the category here. And the last thing I'll say about this piece, which is, I just said that I don't feel like I have the legal authority to issue a ruling on the status of deaf people. Well, I'm just some schmo. But in this opinion that we just read, he also concludes and says, I really would be inclined to say that deaf people have full legal status, but I don't have the legal authority to say so. I'm not a big enough rabbi to say so, which is, this is one of the major rabbis in Israel, and yet he's still saying, like, I'm not sure we can actually break out of these categories. And that, at a certain point, forces us to ask the question, like, when does humility end and cowardice begin in the formation of legal opinions? And I think maybe we have to leave off on that question. I saw one last hand. Agnes, did you want to say something before we close?
What you just said was beautiful. I almost don't want to, but I found those last couple of stories so moving, and I just want to. I'm reminded that another hero in this story, in a certain way, is the person, or a position to occupy in the story, is the person who starts that school, or the teachers who teach in that school. Like, what does it mean to be in a position of, like, actually going outside the law, but reaching back towards the law from that position of being outside? Like, I think to tell the story from the point of view of within the law of these great legal scholars and leaders of the community, that they're important protagonists in this journey, as are the tailors that I love that the other people we've talked about earlier are tailors, but that there's also this, it's like a weird position to be occupying, to be a teacher in that school, to sort of like create a category outside of what is acceptable, but to be reaching back towards this legal system that in some ways rejects you or says that you're not part of it.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you raised this point, because it's a really interesting postscript to our conversation. Jen raised this question earlier, what it means when formalism reifies its own structures. And we talked about the way that, like, oh, actually sometimes when those structures get undone, then but someone's stepping out of the structures to begin with. And I think what this raises is the really interesting question of whether or not there is a role for civil disobedience within Jewish law. We don't usually think of it that way, because if you don't keep Jewish law, then you reject the whole system. But what if you reject one law, right? The way that, you know, Thoreau spoke of it, the way that Dr. King spoke of it, and just said, I am a participant in the system, but this law is untenable and it's unjust, and I protest this law. What is it? Is there a role for civil disobedience within the context of Jewish law? You know, and that's, and maybe the answer is obviously yes. Maybe that is, maybe women rabbis have done exactly that, right? Or those who have minted women rabbis have done exactly that. But it's still, it feels like a strange formulation in the language of traditional Jewish law. We're over time here, but I want to show you one last opinion, and I just want to, so I'm going to do it anyway. Obviously, people can take off if they need to, but I want to just move back and just to show you the enduring power of formalism. Here's another modern opinion, the most modern opinion from the State of Israel. And he says this thing which I think expresses, look, we may not be sympathetic to the formalist position, but here is the power that it holds. And I think that even as I am 100% clear, I feel 100% certain that a deaf person should have full status in Jewish life, knowing what I know about deaf people. I do also now, as you know, being a rabbi for a while, I understand the power of formalism, and it's worth just hearing it on our way out so that we know what we're up against. And here, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says that the bottom line is that regarding a cheresh, a deaf person, it's extremely difficult to make a decision in a matter that the Torah giants whose waters we drink have already analyzed at great length without arriving at a consensus position. But it is also extremely difficult to push them away, God forbid, from fulfilling the mitzvot. So there, he says it right there, like, I feel so bound by the tradition. What am I going to do? Reject the opinions of the sages that have come before me and the Talmud that's come before me? And I want us to, even in our liberal community, have some sympathy for the truth of that just desire to just humbly adhere to the tradition. And yet that same voice says, but it doesn't make any sense. And it breaks the heart. And I think that, and that is in some ways the message that I want to leave us with, is that the breaking of the heart is an essential part of the development of Jewish law. And we don't ever think about that piece. But when the Katav Sofer goes into that school and just looks at deaf people so vibrantly and fully communicating, his heart breaks and he realizes, my God, we've been keeping it from these full human beings, right? And those moments of real heartbreak have to be a part of the system as well, right? And may we progress, may we move forward on this issue and on so many issues of exclusion that still plague our legal system. Thanks everybody for joining me in this journey. It was meaningful to me, and I appreciate you being in dialogue on this very important issue. Wish everybody a good day.